Skyrim isn't just about killing dragons and stealing sweet rolls. It's also about people. The Elder Scrolls is full of history, lore, and clashes between people of different factions, races, beliefs, and identities. If you've spent any time in Windhelm, or remember meeting Vaelin Dreth in Oblivion, you've probably noticed something. Tamriel has a racism problem. Dark Elves are pushed into slums. Argonians are banned from living within certain city walls. Khajiit are treated with suspicion, refused entry into towns, and forced to camp outside. Not even religion is safe, as Nords are told they can no longer worship Talos, a god central to their identity. If these problems only existed in a video game, then the world would be a far better place. Unfortunately, there are practically an infinite number of instances where what we see happening to the fantasy races in Skyrim were inspired by real-world discrimination and racism. In this video, I want to explore how racism and oppression are woven into Skyrim, what sociology can teach us about it, and how this fictional world mirrors very real struggles in our own. Before we get started, I need to be upfront about who I am. I'm speaking as a white, straight, middle-class man. Because of this, I can count on maybe one finger the amount of times I have personally experienced anything like racial-based discrimination. As such, I absolutely do not pretend to know how systemic and societal injustice actually feels, and in no way mean to diminish or even overshadow people who have experienced this. Instead, I just want to use sociology as a lens to view racial discrimination in the Elder Scrolls, mostly focused on Skyrim, and draw parallels to the real world. Video games aren't just escapism, they reflect the societies that make them. So when Skyrim depicts racism, exclusion, and inequality, it opens up a chance to think critically about why those systems feel so familiar. In the description of this video, I'm going to link to some charities that specifically help victims of discrimination that do outstanding work in this area. There's no pressure for you to donate if you can't, but it would be remiss of me to discuss topics on this and not do something to help alleviate some of the symptoms, even if it's in a small way. And no, I don't get any credit or kickbacks from this. I average like 50 views a video. There are no sponsors here. Right, with my cards on the table, what do sociologists say about racism, and how can we apply this to the Elder Scrolls? One way that Skyrim highlights oppression is through in-groups and out-groups. Sociologist Henri Tajfel developed something called social identity theory, which says we build our self-esteem by identifying with groups we belong to, and comparing ourselves to groups we don't. The easiest way to make yourself feel better about you and your group? Making yourself appear to be better, or more worthy, or generally superior to those around you. In Skyrim, this is everywhere. The Nords constantly describe themselves as the true sons and daughters of Skyrim. They see themselves as the rightful owners of the land, and that identity is tied up with their culture, history, and traditions. From a lore perspective, this could maybe be an arguable position. Nords are descendants of a race called the Atamorans, from way back in the Merethic era. They were led by Ysgramor to the land that later became known as Skyrim. Over time, tensions began to rise with the local population, the Snow Elves. Eventually this came to a head when the nearby settlement of Snow Elves assaulted the first Atmoran town, Sarthal. After a brief retreat, the Atmorans returned and waged war to conquer the land, and become permanent settlers of all of Skyrim, systematically wiping out the Snow Elves at every opportunity. This began their reputation of assuming their superiority to any and all other races they encountered, and remains a common belief by the time we reach the events of Skyrim. Dark Elves, or Dunmer, fled to Morrowind after the eruption of Red Mountain, and ended up as refugees in Windhelm. Instead of being welcomed by the Nordic population, they're crammed into a segregated neighbourhood, the Grey Quarter, and treated as outsiders. It's well documented by various sociologists, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Patillo, and D. Franklin Frazier, that the result of forcing a population to a specific area and having them economically deprived is systemic oppression and discrimination being further reinforced. More on that later. Here on Earth, this has parallels stretching back as far as the British Empire, and even before. The Americas, Asia, Australasia, you name it, the British Empire generally turned up and instigated inhumane acts of warfare, genocide, slavery, and destruction. Whilst certainly not the first accounts of racial-based tensions to have ever existed, the British Empire can be blamed for some of the most egregious and wide-reaching acts of racism the world has ever seen. All the while, the British would heighten their own sense of self-importance by claiming to be conducting God's will, by denigrating people indigenous to these countries as animalistic or backwards, or a host of other slurs that I'm not about to give any airtime to. In more modern times, we're witnessing the same oppression listed by our sociological friends from earlier. With the genocide in Gaza, the rise of far-right political parties in most of the Western world, and the formation and support for groups like ICE or the Reform Party, once again we're seeing the same rhetoric and impact. Groups of people are insisting they're superior in some way and consistently discriminating against and othering entire ethnic and religious groups. These dynamics are unfortunately more than fantasy. Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls lore exemplify how racism presents itself on a very obvious scale. Outsiders are blamed, marginalised, and oppressed to strengthen the identity of the dominant group. But Skyrim doesn't stop at individual prejudice. It also shows us how racism can be institutionalised and effected at scale. Sociologists Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton argue that racism isn't just about people being biased, it's systemic. Overt racism is typically interpersonal. That basically means the most obvious instances of racism you witness are between people. Perhaps it's the use of slurs, violence, assaults, or segregation. Maybe it's Englishmen vandalising roundabouts with a St. George's Cross. Perhaps it's an assembly of Unite the Kingdom protesters loudly proclaiming their ignorance at scale. It's hard to miss, almost universally agreed as a terrible thing, and is the most obvious way that people get labelled as racist. Institutionalised or systemic racism is different. It takes a far more subtle form, and as such, can get by on a far larger scale for far longer than any overt acts ever could. It's things like inequalities built into laws, policies, and customs that restrict access to resources and opportunities. In Skyrim, there are actual, explicit policies that segregate people. Argonians are legally kept outside the walls of Windhelm. Khajiits aren't allowed into major cities at all, cutting them off from trade and protection. The Grey Quarter isn't just a nickname, it's an enforced slum for Dunmer. These aren't just individuals yelling at other races, they're structural barriers designed to keep power in the hands of the dominant group. This is quite overt for the sake of a video game to get its racism points across, but in our world, this imbalance is not quite as explicit. In the real world, institutionalised racism is everywhere, and has been for as long as there have been institutions. There are a host of examples, spanning education, entering the workforce, housing, the criminal justice system, and basically every other facet of life. It's documented thoroughly that in the US and the UK, if you are perceived to be or identify as a person of colour or from a minority ethnic group, it's substantially more difficult to gain access to high-quality education. The reasons for this vary greatly. Some causes are related to having a higher likelihood of being from a lower socioeconomic group, which limits your ability to apply for private schools or to move locations to areas where the schooling systems are better funded. It can be caused by tests and assessments that are created with the inherent biases that exclude non-white populations by default, with assumed knowledge, prior opportunities available, or based on certain cultural traditions. It can even approach more overt interpersonal racism, as in many cases, applicants to scholarships or education are discarded on account of the assessor presuming the applicant is from a minority and exercising their own prejudice and discrimination in the decision-making process. The criminal justice system is, in my opinion, the most clear-cut example of systemic racism in action. If you're from a minority ethnic group or are a person of colour, you're much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, but not as a lawyer. These groups have a substantially higher rate of being stopped and searched illegally and ineffectively on the street, have a higher likelihood of being the victim of harsher sentences, are disproportionately overrepresented as populations in prisons, the rates of falsified or wrongly convicted cases are far greater, and the chances of recidivism, which means reoffending or reconviction of something else, in the future are higher. This is not the result of minorities committing more criminal behaviour. This is the result of systemic, institutionalised racism within the police and the criminal justice system. It's even reflected in the fact that this year, in 2025 in England and Wales, only 12% of all judges are listed as non-white, and only 1% as specifically black. This has knock-on effects in all parts of the criminal justice system, as judges bring their own biases and preconceived ideas into sentencing, discussions with news outlets, and advice to police departments. Police officers in both the US and the UK are known for racial profiling and discrimination, which causes real impact on lives. Famous cases such as Stephen Lawrence, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor illustrate this. Discrimination is built into the systems. The actions of the individual officers are for sure their own choices, but the research demonstrates it's also as a result of the failings of the institution as a whole. Skyrim's institutions reflect this reality in an overt way. Our world's institutions do so in a less overt way. This is why people still defend these systems as not racist. People misunderstand, willingly or otherwise, what racism means, so unless they see someone drop slurs, they often don't want to accuse someone or something as being racist. This is how these systems continue to operate today. They're not deemed overt enough for the general population to agree they require change, so they remain. This all begs the question, why do these systems exist in the first place? The short answer is to maintain power. Karl Marx's conflict theory says societies are built on struggles between groups over limited, or at least perceived as limited, resources. There is the class of people who have access to money, property, capital, food, opportunity. They're referred to as the bourgeoisie. And there is a class of people who don't, and work within the systems of control set by the bourgeoisie. They're called the proletariat. In Skyrim, the oppression of outsiders is not random. It protects Nordic power. Argonians and Khajiit are kept out of the city so they don't compete for housing, political influence, or trade. Their exclusion preserves Nord dominance in Windhelm's economy and culture. The Empire's ban on Talos worship works in the same way. Regardless of being forced upon them by the Aldemiri Dominion, it works to control the Nordic population. Nords are very proud of their heritage and closeness to Talos, and severing this undermines their position as an entire species. Here in our world, if you're part of the group that has access to all the resources you could ever want, all the food you'd ever eat, functionally limitless money, any opportunity in life to pursue, the nicest house you could dream of, you would work tirelessly to ensure that you and your family keep this stuff. The easiest way to do that is to control the systems and functions that helped you get them in the first place. This means you can rig the system to favour you, or people similar to you, to continue winning in the future. This comes at the expense of people who are not like you, or people who you don't deem important enough or relevant enough to be benefited. If you're the subject of these systems, you're doing the very real, hard work of supporting the bourgeoisie and their way of life. This could be building their property for them, investing their capital for them, or being excluded from opportunities to improve and create your own development. This both benefits the people already at the top of the system, while at the same time disempowering you from accumulating enough social and capital wealth to carve your own piece of the system, or use your resources to inspire change within it. As you are likely aware, on Earth, the richest and most influential people in existence are predominantly white men. Look at Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump. They all control vast swathes of wealth and are able to use their near-limitless resources to remain in control. Social media is known to underpromote people of colour creators and overpromote right-wing white creators. The current president of the US has systematically dismantled as many systems of support as he can for people of colour, whilst at the same time promoting explicit racism and division. The mainstream media gives countless hours of airtime, story coverage and favouritism to very right-wing political parties, at the expense of the parties more likely to support minorities. People of colour are treated as the proletariat at every turn. So if you listen to Karl Marx, the only way to undo this is to seize the means of production. Just saying. Oppression is rarely an accident. It's strategic. It's calculated. It's self-fulfilling. It exists to perpetuate the systems that benefit those at the top, and it is very hard to tackle directly. Indigenous groups are excluded from land rights to benefit settlers. Migrant workers are denied legal protections to keep them cheap and exploitable. When power is unequal, systems of oppression make sure it stays that way. Skyrim, this is still a Skyrim video, shows this bluntly. Oppression benefits those who already hold power. As I hinted at a little earlier on, religion adds another layer to oppression in Skyrim. The Elder Scrolls throws a bit of a wrench in the works when discussing religion, as practically any and all religions believed are definitively true. Whilst we could argue for the rest of time on the validity of various religions in our world, Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind and all the rest illustrate that virtually no matter what you believe in Tamriel, you're probably right. This means that when the Nords idealise one of their gods, Talos, it's incredibly real for them. There's actual historical records of Talos doing wondrous things, from leading armies to changing entire geographies in Cyrodiil. There's no discourse around Talos being a concept or a way of thinking versus a literal man. It's evident he actually existed and actually did a bunch of the things attributed to him. So, when the Empire bans Talos worship, it's not a neutral policy. For Nords, Talos isn't just a god, he's a symbol of their culture, their history, their independence. Outlawing him doesn't just attack faith, it fractures this identity. Emil Durkheim argued that religion isn't just belief, it's a source of social cohesion. This is the idea that societies are effectively glued together by a range of invisible shared forces, and the number of these bonds and the strength of them increases the feeling of a community or group being unified. This comes in two main flavours: mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Mechanical is the result of groups of people sharing ideology, like religion, beliefs, and moral values, that are used to create cohesion of the group. It's ultimately easier to identify with one another if these are aligned. Organic solidarity is more focused on the roles that people play within the group. For a group to function, a variety of jobs need filling. People to look after the kids, people to make the food, people to provide security. This interdependence is a more modern approach to social cohesion. As you'll notice, it sounds a lot like the systems we actually have. When any of this is attacked by either literal aggression or systemic oppression, it can cause groups to break and shatter. This is used to keep those being victimized by racial discrimination from forming a strong, cohesive, and collective retaliation. By committing a genocide in Gaza and literally destroying everything from children to hospitals to aid workers, it's being made impossible for social groups to remain whole. By constantly arresting key people of colour leaders such as Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, or Martin Luther King, there was a clear assault, often quite literally, on distinct groups of people, with an evident effort to destroy those social bonds holding them together. By committing genocide against the Jewish population, Hitler was overtly trying to eradicate an entire religion and all its people so he could further his own narrative and influence. Both Skyrim and the real world show us that dismantling religion is never just about the divine. It's about power, identity, and enforcing the status quo. So, what does Skyrim show us about racism and oppression? It illustrated that inequality isn't just about individuals being racist. It's about systems, laws, customs, and cultural narratives that define who belongs and who doesn't. Social identity theory explains how in-groups and out-groups form. Systemic racism shows how exclusion is built into institutions. Conflict theory reveals that oppression is a tool for maintaining power. Social cohesion demonstrates how religion, identity, and belief are tied to power and its control. Skyrim remains relevant to us 14 years after release because it's a vehicle that mirrors these dynamics. Its world is compelling not just because of dragons and magic, but because it unashamedly shows us the ugly side of how a diverse world would work. Its characters are microcosms of systems at large, to teach us complex concepts without really trying. So, what do you think? Does Skyrim reflect our own world in terms of discrimination, racism, and exclusion? Or have I read into this too much and got carried away using my criminology degree? If you could hit subscribe, that would be welcome, and if you like this video, you'll probably like this other one that's floating somewhere on the screen. Somewhere. Don't forget to check out the Charities linked in the description, and if you have any requests or corrections you'd like to share with me, drop me a comment below. I reply to everyone and genuinely love receiving the feedback. See you next time.